Please pray with me. Living God, today's good news is so wondrous, so magnificent, that we struggle to wrap our heads around it. Give our hearts the wisdom to receive that which our heads cannot fully understand. Send your Spirit to fill our whole bodies with your resurrection promise. This we pray in your holy and good name. Amen. If you ever find yourself scrolling through Netflix or some other streaming service, you'll see all these different categories for movies. And these categories, they help us to know what we can expect if we're watching one of these films. If it's a comedy, you can expect to laugh. If it's a drama, you can expect to feel some suspense. If it's a rom-com, you can expect to go, "Aw." If you walk into a room and say your family or your friends are watching a movie, even if it's a movie you've never seen before, it doesn't take that long to figure out which category or genre this movie belongs in. If there's guns and explosions, this is an action movie. If there's cute cartoon animals, this is a kid's movie. When Peter and the other disciple and Mary arrived at the empty tomb on that Easter Sunday morning, they had no category to explain this. They had no category to put this situation in. This was something completely new. They had no idea what was going on. They had never encountered anything like this. They arrived there that Sunday morning. They were expecting this to be a tragedy. They thought they knew what category this experience was going to fall under, because they had all experienced this before. They've experienced mourning. They've experienced death. They've experienced loss. They know what that's like. They know what the routines are. You go, you mourn, you weep. You do these sorts of things. This is what they were expecting when they showed up. But they show up and they see that the tomb is empty. What was going on? What category does this fit in now? They have no idea what to do with this unexpected situation. The Christian claim, and the claim of Easter, is that Jesus' resurrection actually breaks down all of the old categories that we used to use to make sense of the world and introduces us to a new category. This category of the gospel, something that's higher than what we used to understand, something that breaks down the old ways that we used to make sense and categorize the world. This is something that has never been seen before, that's never been done before. It's a story that's never been told before, of God becoming man, dying as a criminal, and raising back to life. And all of Christianity, all of Christian faith, all the generations and thousands of years and billions of believers around the world, all of what is going on this Sunday morning hinges on what happened that Sunday morning, on whether or not that is what took place. The question that they were asking, what category does this situation fit in? That's the question that Christians have been talking about for centuries since that morning. And all of Christian faith hangs on that event, the event that took place all those years ago. There's a theologian, Joseph Johnson, he writes that by its very nature, the gospel stands or falls with the historicity of Jesus. If the historicity of Jesus fades away in the vapors of time, the whole content of the gospel vanishes with it. Without the historical resurrection of Jesus, the Bible becomes just another book of religious stories, of good morals. It becomes another book that's fairly easy to categorize under the moral teaching section or the mythical stories section. But if the resurrection really did happen, well, then that changes everything. That means that now there's a new category for understanding the world. It means that things aren't the way that they used to be. That in fact, new things are coming and unexpected things are happening. So this morning, I want us to look at this claim, at the historical claim of Jesus' resurrection, and look at what kind of confidence we can have about whether or not these events really happened. And if they did, what that means for you and me and the whole world. And so to begin, let's set the context of this. This is a question of history, which means that by definition, it is an event that is unrepeatable. Science studies things that are repeatable. History studies things that are unrepeatable. If you're a good scientist, you're going to get the same results every time you run an experiment in the controlled conditions of your lab. But if you're a good historian, you're studying events that happened once and only once at a certain time in a specific place. For example, George Washington crossed the Delaware River once in 1776, and it meant one thing when he did it then. If he were to do it again another time, it would mean something different the second time. That was an unrepeatable event. Or going back a little further, the Normans conquered England once in 1066. This is an event that happened once. If to prove that this happened, we had to repeat this event, well then, I think the English would have something to say about that. Jesus' resurrection is an unrepeatable event because it's something that happened in history. That means that we're not going to have the exact details, the exact specifics that you could expect from a scientific experiment that is repeatable, but it doesn't mean that we have nothing. It means that we have reliable sources that can tell us about this, just like we have other sources that tell us about other events in history. For example, on October 25th, 1946, two of the greatest philosophers met at Cambridge University for the first and the only time. Ludwig Wittgenstein was a professor at Cambridge, professor of analytic philosophy, and he was a well-established figure there. But Karl Popper, this young up-and-coming philosopher, he had some disagreements with some of Wittgenstein's ideas. And so he wrote this paper and he came to the college to deliver them to the board and the staff and the students there. And he was going to engage Wittgenstein in this debate of ideas. And so they meet in this lounge with others. There are other members of the philosophy department and students. And they're sitting by the fire, and Karl Popper is reading his essay critiquing Wittgenstein, when Wittgenstein gets up and interrupts him in the middle of the paper. He waves a fire poker around that was in the fireplace, and then he leaves, and he does not come back. Here, the stories of what exactly happened differ greatly. If you ask some, they'll say that Wittgenstein picked up a red-hot poker from out of the fire, and he was threatening Karl Popper with it. Others say that the poker was cold, that it was just sitting next to the fire. Some say that he was just using the fire poker to make a point, as part of an illustration that he was using. Others say that he was waving it in Karl Popper's face, threatening to hit him over the head with it. Some say that Wittgenstein left and slammed the door on his way out. Others say that he just simply left quietly and didn't return. The stories differ, and the event only happened once. So it's impossible to say with exact certainty what exactly happened at that event, but there are some things about this event that nobody doubts. Nobody doubts that it happened. Nobody doubts that the main two characters in this story were Wittgenstein and Karl Popper. Nobody doubts that a fire poker was used for something. Nobody doubts that he left and that he didn't return. There are some things about this that we can't know for sure, but there are some things that are logical conclusions based on the witnesses of the people that were there. The gospel that we read this morning, from the Gospel of John, it's one of 4 accounts of what happened that Easter morning at the empty tomb. And there are some things that this gospel has in common with the others, which make it very logical to conclude that what they were talking about was what really happened. All of them agree that this happened the Sunday after Jesus' death. All of them agree that women were the first ones to arrive at the tomb. All of them agree that the stone was rolled away and that the tomb was empty. There was no body there. There were only the grave clothes. All of them agree that there was a person or a being dressed in white, telling them that he is not here and that he is risen. All of them agree that when people eventually do see Jesus, they don't see him as a ghost or a vision. Even back then they had categories for this. They knew what ghosts were or had heard stories of people seeing visions. But all of these accounts agree that Jesus was not like this, that Jesus was there physically, that he was touchable, that there was a body there, not this being of light that you could pass your hand through. They all agree that Jesus was not recognized by his followers right away, that there was something different about him, but also something that let them know that he really was who he was before. All of these things are enough for us to draw logical conclusions, even if we don't have the exact specific details of what happened. We can trust from these accounts that the things they're agreeing on really did happen. This story, along with the other gospel stories, have something else about them too. something that I want to call the brush strokes of reality to them. You know, if you've ever seen a copy or a digital image of Van Gogh's paintings, then you'll know some of what his artwork is like. But a while back, Jen and I went on a trip to Chicago and we visited the Art Institute there. And they have this whole wing of these Van Gogh paintings on the wall. And if you go up and you look closely, you can see that on these paintings, you can actually see the brushstrokes in the art pieces. You know, he used this thick paint and these heavy brushstrokes. And when you look, you can see the texture that differentiates the real painting from the copies or the digital images. It has the brushstrokes, it has the texture. The gospel story that we read this morning and the other accounts of Jesus' resurrection have what I want to call the brushstrokes of reality to them. These are stories that have the defining features and characteristics of things that really happened. They don't have the sort of things that you would expect if somebody was making up this kind of story. You know, there are these odd details that are in there, like the two disciples running, and one gets there first and waits outside while Peter runs right past and goes in. And then they see the grave clothes, like some are lying there, but randomly the face cloth is nicely folded. There are these little details like that why would somebody make something up like this? It's not like the witnesses had something to gain from creating a story like this. You know, normally if somebody's telling you a story that sounds too good to be true, or, you know, it's got that funny feeling like something is off, it's because this person has something to gain from it. Whether it's something that will make them money or increase their status or things like that. The story that we read this morning, the witnesses telling this have nothing to gain from making up a story like this. In fact, the witnesses, most of them died horrible deaths because they were telling stories like this. This isn't something that they made up to make their lives easier or to gain money or things like that. In fact, this made their lives much harder. And it's little things like that that give these stories the brushstrokes of reality. And perhaps the most obvious, the most glaring thing about this story that indicates that it's not something made up is that all of these accounts have women as the primary witnesses of what happened. In that culture and in those days, a woman's word meant almost nothing. Women were not allowed to be witnesses in courts of law. Their accounts were not credible. You know, back then, women had almost no say in society. So if you were making up a story about this, there is no way that you would include as your star, key, primary witness to these events a woman. And yet all of the gospel accounts do. All of them agree that Mary Magdalene, some of the women that were there, were the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. And that they were the ones to go and tell the disciples, that they were the ones that kick-started this new movement. If you were making up a story, there is no way that you would choose to have your key witnesses be women like this. The only reason you would have this as part of the story is if that's what really happened. It has the brushstrokes of reality to it. And yet, even with all of this evidence, all of these things pointing to it, accepting the fact that Jesus rose from the dead that Easter Sunday morning is still an act of faith. It's not something that I believe I could stand up here and prove to you logically without a doubt. There are very, very few things in the world that can be proven in that way. Accepting that Jesus walked out of that tomb as a resurrected and living Savior is still something that is accepted on faith. It requires faith not for lack of evidence. I think there is good evidence pointing that you can have justified faith in believing that this is a real historical event. It requires faith because of the life-changing consequences that come from believing in something like this. If you believe that this is something that really happened, you cannot go on living with business as usual. This is something that is life-changing. Believing that this sort of historic event really took place is something that completely and fundamentally changes the categories you use to understand the world, the categories you use to understand yourself. You cannot look at the world the same way. You know, we live in a world where God has come to us, is what Easter is saying. It's telling us something new. It's telling us that God has come to us and loved us enough to die for us, telling us that death is not the end, as we have all experienced and thought throughout our lives that once you're gone, you are gone. This is telling us that God has not only come to us, he's not only died for us, he's not only raised for us, but he sees us and he meets us and he calls us by name. Mary doesn't know who he is until he says her name, says Mary. She turns around and her eyes are opened. What Easter is telling us is we have a Savior who not only has conquered death for all time, but who knows you by name, who calls you by name, introduces himself and introduces the life-changing good news that he is risen, that the world is different, that the old categories are breaking down. There have always been some who have struggled to believe this more than others, and usually it's the folks who have more to lose from the old ways of life breaking down, from the old categories being erased. It's the people with advantages that usually have the hardest time believing that the old world is fading and that Jesus has come to introduce something new. I'm going to read a quote. It's a rather long quote, but I think it summarizes what happened on that Easter morning better than almost anyone else that I've read. It's from N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope. He says, "I am convinced that the climate of skepticism, which for the last 200 years has made it unfashionable and even embarrassing to suggest that Jesus' resurrection really happened, was never and is not now itself a neutral thing, sociologically or politically. That those who say that it's unfashionable or embarrassing to believe this have something to gain from this. Who, after all, was it who didn't want the dead to be raised? Not simply the intellectually timid or the rationalists. It was and is those in power, the social and intellectual tyrants and bullies. The Caesars who would be threatened by a lord of the world who had defeated the tyrant's last weapon, death itself. The Herods who would be horrified at the post-mortem validation of the true King of the Jews. And this is the point where believing in the resurrection of Jesus suddenly ceases to be a matter of inquiring about an odd event in the first century and becomes a matter of rediscovering hope now, in the 21st century. Hope is what you get when you suddenly realize that a different worldview is possible. A worldview in which the rich, the powerful, and the unscrupulous do not, after all, have the last word. The same worldview shift that is demanded by the resurrection of Jesus is the shift that will enable us to transform the world. Jesus' resurrection breaks our old categories of understanding the world, of understanding what it means to have power, of what it means to live a life fully alive. Jesus' resurrection introduces us to something brand new, something better than what we could have hoped for or even imagined. And it's an invitation to begin building this new and better future even now. It's not this invitation to wait for a heaven that is far off, but it's an invitation to see that heaven is broken in at a specific point in history and has begun remaking the world around us. It breaks down the old categories and gives us something new. Now, I want to use just one last illustration to kind of paint a picture of what happens when you accept the historic event of Jesus' resurrection as a real event and the life-changing consequences that come from it. This past week, a number of us got to go to a piano recital at Sac State in Capistrano Hall, the recital hall there. We got to hear this amazing music. Now imagine that Sac State University is gifted the greatest piano that the world has ever seen. This piano that's hand-carved from mahogany that only grows in certain microclimates of Brazil. And the keys on the piano are repurposed from the original pianos that Beethoven and Mozart wrote their songs on. And there's gold inlay on the piano, and the strings of the piano are tempered to hold their pitch and tune perfectly. This is the greatest piano ever made by human hands, and it's given as a gift to the university. And the university says they receive this gift and they realize we can't just plop this in the middle of old Capistrano Hall. We need to do something new about this. We need to make this the centerpiece of our university. This is an incredible gift. Artists from all over the world are going to want to come here and play this one-of-a-kind piano. And so what they decide to do is they demolish Capistrano Hall And instead they build this new recital hall with this incredible, beautiful piano at the centerpiece. They design the architecture around this tremendous gift. They design it so that the acoustic experience of listening to this piano is enhanced, so that every part of the building is situated and all the seats are laid out in such a way to emphasize this incredible gift that has been given to the university. They've been given something incredibly good, and it means that they need to tear down and destroy their old ways that they used to house their pianos and do their recitals. It means they need to build something even bigger and better and grander to accentuate this gift that's been given to them. That's what it's like when the resurrection is gifted to you, when it comes into your life. It means that we break down the old ways that we used to understand the world. It means we break down the old ways of thinking that more is more, and that money is what's going to make us happy, and pleasure and fame, that these are the things that are going to make us happy. It means breaking down these old values and building a new house, a new recital hall around this gift of the resurrection that's been given to you, and allow the beautiful music of the gospel to fill our lives in this newly constructed gospel home. To hear the music that began on that Easter Sunday, the music that is still playing, the music that Jesus told Mary to go and sing this melody to the disciples so that they'll know that there is a new way of life now. Something new has entered the world. Sing this song, spread this music. It's what the gospel is. It's a song that began on Easter Sunday. It's a song we still sing today. A song that is growing and becoming this symphony all over the world that will culminate in this new kingdom that God is bringing. Please pray with me. God, we thank you for the gift of your Son. We thank you for the gift of the resurrection and the hope that we can have that you are doing something new in this world. God, help us to tear down our old structures, our old categories, our old ways of understanding the world, that we might build new lives, that you might build new hearts in us that accentuate this gift. God, we thank you for changing the world. We thank you for doing it in our world. We ask that we could remember this fact each day, that it would continue to transform us, that it would continue to help us recategorize the world according to the gospel instead of the old ways. God, may this good news change our lives forever. Amen.